Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to talk about why the LS is the king and how to swap one into your classic. It is time to put some meat on those LS swap bones. Why is the LS the king? Well, the LS has been around a long time and it has developed this incredible reputation for making crazy horsepower easily, for being reliable and durable, for just being an all-around great engine, and people have been swapping them into everything from boats to airplanes. And they are very cost effective. You can pick up an engine relatively cheap and they're just everywhere. So let's talk about why the LS is the king. Also make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Alright, now that we've established the LS is the king, what do you need to know if you want to swap one into your classic? Well, first off, there are tons of different engines to choose from in the LS family. We're going to cover the basics today, but there's really a lot to unpack here. If you're looking at a budget build, maybe you don't need a ton of power and you just want something that ease gone na go in your classic and run like a champ without breaking. The bank you may want to consider a Gen 3 5.3 or a 6.0. These engines will definitely get the job done and they are gone na be much cheaper than going with a newer gen for 6.2 or even a 7.0. But then again, if you're planning to make some serious power, you may want to spend the extra cash on a newer engine because they are capable of producing a lot more power. Then of course there is the ultimate top of the food chain, which is the L6 engine that is when we are talking about engines from GM. There's also a bunch of engines from other manufacturers that people are putting in their classic cars. So you have a lot of choices. Just make sure that whatever engine you choose, you do your homework on it and understand the differences between them and the capabilities of each one. Now let's talk transmissions. You have a bunch of choices here as well, and whatever transmission you choose really depends on what engine you went with. If you're going with a budget build, maybe a Gen 3 engine, you may want to consider something like the 4L60E. That was the original transmission that came with a lot of the Gen 3 engines. It'll work just fine. However, if you're going with a higher output engine, maybe you're going with a Gen 4 or even an L6, you may want to consider something beefier like a 4L80E. Now, if you're going with a manual transmission, there's a bunch of options here too. A lot of people like to go with the T56 because it is a robust transmission that can handle a lot of power. It's been around for a while. People have been swapping them in two cars forever. There's also the T56 Magnum, which is a little bit beefier than the standard T56. And of course, you can always go with something like the Richmond Gear Super T10, which is an overdrive transmission that's designed specifically for the LS engine. Again, it really depends on your application and what you want to do with the car. You also have to take into consideration the rest of your drivetrain. So when you're choosing an engine and a transmission, you have to make sure that they're compatible and that they're going to work together well. Then, of course, you also have to think about the rest of your car. What kind of chassis does it have? Is it a solid axle or is it a IFS? How is the suspension set up? How is the steering set up? All of these things need to be considered when you are doing an LS swap because you may have to make some modifications to the car in order for the LS to fit. Now we've covered the engine and the transmission, but let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the wiring harness. The LS wiring harness is notorious for being a pain in the butt to deal with, and it can be a real challenge to figure out, especially if you're not familiar with GM vehicles. There are a lot of different connectors and a lot of different wires, and it can be really confusing to try to figure out where everything goes. Now, luckily, there are companies out there like American Autowire and Painless Performance that make complete wiring kits specifically for LS swaps. So you don't have to worry about trying to figure out where everything goes. You just buy a kit, you follow the instructions, and you're good to go. However, if you want to save a little bit of money, you could try adapting the factory LS wiring harness to your vehicle. This can be a little bit tricky, but it can be done. Just make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into before you start. Another option for the wiring harness is to go with a standalone engine management system or EMS. Now, this can be a little bit more complicated, but it gives you a lot more control over the engine. With a standalone EMS, you can really dial in the engine and make it run exactly how you want it to. And if you're planning to make some serious power, you're probably going to need a standalone EMS anyway. Standalone EMS is basically like having a computer that controls all aspects of the engine. It's essentially replacing the factory ECM, the engine control module. And with a standalone EMS, you can really tune the engine to your liking. You can adjust things like the fuel mapping and the ignition timing and really dial in the engine to make it run exactly how you want it to. This can be a little bit more complicated, however, and it may require a little bit more work than just using a pre-made wiring harness, but it gives you a lot more control over the engine and it's definitely worth considering. Alright, so we've talked about the engine, the transmission, the wiring harness. What else do you need to know if you want to do an LS swap? Well, the actual installation of the engine isn't too difficult. Just make sure you get a good engine mount kit and exhaust kit and cooling kit. All of these things are really important to have in order for the engine to run properly. Once you get those things installed, the engine should go right in. Then, of course, you are gone nah. Have to install the transmission and then you are pretty much done with the hard part. Once you have the engine and transmission installed, you can start working on the tuning. And again, if you're using a standalone EMS, this is where you really get to dial in the engine. Spend some time on the dyno and really get the engine tuned perfectly. Then, of course, once you're done with the tuning, you can start working on the interior of the car, putting in gauges and all that stuff, and then you're pretty much done. You can go ahead and take it for a spin and enjoy the fruits of your labor. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about doing an LS swap. It's not too difficult, but it does take some time and effort. But at the end of the day, it's definitely worth it. Imagine driving your classic car down the road with the modern engine that can produce way more power than the original engine ever could. It is a really cool feeling, and it is definitely something that every gearhead needs to experience at least once in their life. Now we've talked about the basics of doing an LS swap, but there are a lot of resources out there to help you through the process. There are forums, Facebook groups, and YouTube channels dedicated to LS swapping, so don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help if you need it. There are a lot of knowledgeable people out there who are willing to help you out, so what are you waiting for? Start planning your LS swap today and get ready to experience the ultimate combination of old school cool and new school power. Well, that wraps up our discussion about the LS swap. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.